Word begets image, and image is virus. Is virus. And image is word begets image, and image is virus.
The following is a mutation of a backstory written by Bill Ford for a skirmish wargaming event, Hondius. It embodies how play is infecting unsuspecting minds with insidious tales through vectors in the 28 narrative community. No dose of media literacy or boosters of critical thinking can build your immunity to the rot.
Jacques threw another bone onto the fire. Flames lapped hungrily around its edges, its alabaster finish charring as runnels of grease drizzled in the heat. 3 men crowded around the meager warmth, clad in oilskin cloaks. The weather found its way through the roof, fat raindrops sizzling in the fire. Baldwin glanced around, his face hidden in shadow. "Can't be long now. The sun. What you think?" Jacques snorted and spat phlegm into the fire. The flames spat and crackled. Outside, the sky lit and strobed. The deep rumbling of thunder pealed across the sky, muffled by the hovel they crowded in. Not sure. No way to tell. Jacques sniffed and looked away. He was shivering, despite the warmth of the fire. The third companion said nothing, only staring at the fire as he crouched. He loomed larger than the others, his bulk straining against his jacket, his fists planted on the ground. His weight shifted, and he said something unintelligible. Jacques paid him no mind. "We can't stay here. They'll come for us. Them or the knights." Baldwin moaned. Jacques glanced behind him. Their food sat in a corner wrapped in cloth. It wasn't much, but it was something. Food was hard to come by these days on Hondius. Baldwin slowly shook his head. "Would it be better we made a break for it? I heard Whitebridge is with us." Jacques shifted uncomfortably. Whitebridge had fallen to the Baron's men a week ago, but he hadn't had the heart to tell Baldwin. "Don't think so. We hold tight and wait for word from the king." The king would know what to do. Whitebridge had fallen to the Baron's men a week ago, but he hadn't the heart to tell. Jacques stood in the heat, the twin sons of Hondius glaring down at the crowd assembled in the square. Surrounded by thousands, he stood fanning himself with his cap just like everyone else, staring at the stage and awaiting sight or sound of the Baron. Curtains stood to ragged attention on the dais, supported by wooden poles. To either side of the curtains, bored feudalist guards sagged, their weight supported by the long, slender wooden weapons of their oppressive trade. Jacques shifted from one foot to another, his tunic soaked in fetid sweat. All around, others whispered among themselves or mopped their brows. The Baron of their duchy had proclaimed a gathering of the lowborn to Highcrown, the capital of Hondius, a month ago despite the dying summer's heat. While some viewed the respite from fieldwork favorably, Jacques was behind on his tithe, and his yeomen did too. Finally, the drab curtains were drawn aside, and the whispering of the rabble vanished almost immediately. A slender, diminutive man in military arraignment glided between the drawn curtains. Immediately, the guards straightened, their leather jerkins struggling to contain their weight. The Bloody Baron, as he was called, stalked forward, his hands clamped behind his back. He took a small step atop a box on the dais which had been placed for him, bringing him level with the guards. He wore a blood-red sash over his waistcoat, the sash weighed down with medals of his family's honor that he neither earned nor remembered, their meaning lost to time. Epaulets swayed in what little wind blew, and his freshly starched breeches stood in stark contrast to the filthy masses assembled before him. He glared around, daring the gathering to meet his eye. His gaze swept past Jacques, and he averted his eyes, not daring to draw the Baron's ire. Jacques looked back up to see a herald beside the Baron, a raskill-skinned cap adorning his lumpen peasant face. The only thing to mark him out amongst any in the crowd was the long blue tunic which he wore, marking him as the Baron's herald. The man cleared his throat. The ground shook, and Jacques lost contact with the world as the wedge of cavalry slammed home into a knot of men. The man standing next to him was pushed to the side, 2 feet of a spear protruding from his back. The man's arm caught Jacques, and they tumbled to the ground together as the rider passed on. Something roundly clipped Jacques' skull. Jacques scrambled on all fours. He had lost his weapon. His ears rang. His hood from his tunic was twisted around, and he could barely see. He clawed off his coif and hood and stood up. All around, men desperately clutched their weapons, such as they were, while a few brave souls yelled pitifully, trying to arrange the peasants into formation. The band of peasants from Ypres stood for a moment, waving their sharpened stakes at the Baron's men as they rode by. Even from where he stood, Jacques could hear the men's metallic laughter booming from within their helms. A moment later, another group of cavalry slammed into them, making short, bloody work. A man ran by Jacques, his neck tattooed. Not a man, a serf. He threw more than gave, the billhook he had been holding into Jacques' hands without stopping, and ran. All around, peasants were throwing down their weapons, first in ones or twos, then in whole bands. The battle, if it could be called that, was slipping. Jacques weighed his options. His friend Baldwin ran by, caked in blood. He clutched at the left side of his face. He could barely hear Baldwin shouting, but numbly grabbed his arm and they hurried into the woods. As they reached the wood line, he gave one last glance backwards at a group from Siren Village. They stood, their weapons at their feet. A man strode forward, raised a long, pointed box at a boy. He heard the distinct whip, crack of the discharge of the weapon, and the boy's chest exploded. Swords rose and fell. Blood flowed. Jacques cried out. A noise broke Jacques from his reverie. The third companion grunted, lifted his right hand, and inspected it as if for the first time. Jacques' whole head could very well have fit in the meaty paw. The flames reflected off its smooth pate and danced in its bulbous eyes. Its lantern jaw jutted outward, its underbite almost comically large. Baldwin eyed the thing warily. Jacques paid it no mind. It knew few words in Florentin, outside of hungry meat and shit. "We can't stay here, Jacques. It ain't safe. We'll be found eventually. Let's make for Whitebridge." And Baldwin shifted uncomfortably. "I'm getting the sores, and I don't mind saying," he complained bitterly. Jacques looked at the leaking roof. The drips had lessened. Avoiding the mention of Whitebridge, he sighed. "Fine. Once the rains break, we make for Falk's Ridge. If I remember, the king had a bolt hole there." He spat. "That work for you, Baldwin?" Baldwin nodded glumly, but didn't answer. "What about you, George?" Jacques smiled up at the beast. The thing turned its mountainous head after a second delay and grinned. Its lips curled back to reveal stumpy squares of what could be teeth. He didn't know why he'd named the brood after his pet Kalilper he'd had back home before the revolt. It just fit. King, George rumbled. Its smile disappeared. Jacques smirked. The man in question was the Beggar King, their leader, their saint. Some had said he was a noble, others that he came from the stars. Some whispered that he was not even of this world. Wherever he came from, his fiery speeches had roused enough hearts to march in protest of the Baron's most recent outrage. He'd refused command until he had no choice, taking the moniker of Beggar King in irony to what they stood for: the death of the nobility and the birth of just rule for all. The man produced a scroll from his sleeve, unfurled it, and spoke into the vellum. By order of the Baron de Coucy, rightful lord and protectorate of the Duchy of Coucy, does he hereby declare a new tax, tithe, and levy to be placed upon the noble people of Coucy on behalf of the oligarch Virat and King Rheingal III of his name. Not a sound was heard, not a word muttered. The breaths of those assembled at the gathering caught in their throats, sweat beading on their brows and fists clenching at their sides. Some hung their heads, others looked to the sky. The birth and hearth tax, as it shall be known from this day forward, shall levy a single ducat for each child within a hearth, and a sylving for each hearth in a village. There was a pause. So mote it be. Shocked silence filled the air. The Baron glared down his nose, his lips pursed. His guards tapped the butts of their weapons on the dais and turned to salute their leader. The Baron spun and walked back through the curtains, disappearing into the darkness. The herald snapped the scroll shut and followed. In the distance, a crow cried. Slowly, the people shuffled away, too scared to speak. After they were a safe distance away, Baldwin approached Jacques through the crowd. Someone ought to do something about this. How will we survive? He glanced around conspiratorially, hoping no one had overheard. Jacques paid the others no mind. I'm sure we are not the only ones thinking that, Baldwin. We do the best we can, hey? Jacques tried to put his friend at ease with an easy smile, but neither were convinced. They followed the tide of humanity outwards through the winding streets of High Crown. Ahead, the walls of the capital loomed, the crumbling gate a maw of that swallowed the peasants in shadow as they passed within. As Jacques and Baldwin walked along, they overheard the fiery speech of a man, his voice feverish with excitement. As the companions broke into sunlight, they could see the cause of commotion. A man stood atop a knoll in what was once finery, but now caked in muck. He was long-haired with kind eyes and had a long, forked beard which was tucked into his waist. He'd his arms raised in supplication to the sky as he listed the Baron's vices and crimes against the common man. Scores surrounded him, with more crowding around by the second. Murmurs of agreement spread like wildfire, tears creating clean furrows down Baldwin's dusty face. It was not just. Something had to be done.
Head swap.